for helping us with these series and bringing everyone together. But this is an exciting time to come together with our partners and our members, obviously in slightly different format to usual. Well on that, we're all getting used to that. But an opportunity to focus on what net zero means, and some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges that we all face in getting there. So we have a really interesting mix on the panel, and thank you all for attending. A mix of both international and local New Zealand experience. And really, yeah, as I said, we're here to reflect on the huge opportunity that is faced in the infrastructure sector, and the potential it has for really driving the change and delivering positive outcomes for New Zealand. ISCA has put out a net zero futures paper on the topic. If you haven't seen it already, I believe Carlos will be putting a link to that paper in the chat function, which is down the bottom of the screen. But the format for the webinar today, firstly, we have Maria Manadaki, who will be giving a brief presentation on her experience, and will address the international space surrounding approaches to net zero, and tailoring that for opportunities within the New Zealand context. We'll then also briefly hear from our other panelists, Steve Colleen from Downer, Rosie Mercer, who's the GM of Sustainability of the Ports of Auckland, and Mike Burrell, the Executive Director of the Sustainable Business Council. So welcome to all you guys. After those brief sessions, there will be a Q&A where you're asked or encouraged to put questions in the Q&A chat function, which again is down the bottom of the screen. But first, before we do that, we're going to open with a quick poll question that will pop up on your screen now. Carlos, if you could bring that up. And this is really to set the mood for the session today. And the question is, how would you rate the readiness of the infrastructure sector to respond to and address climate change risks? Would you say high, well-educated sector, medium, understands the importance of climate change, or low, understand likely impacts but don't understand the role of the sector? And I'll give you just a brief period to reflect and answer that, and then we'll get into the proceedings. Okay, Carlos, I think that's probably time enough for everyone to have. So, and here are the results, fresh off the press. So we have a resounding medium to low response, which is very interesting. And I think it reflects, I guess, the timeliness of this session and the eagerness that everyone is showing to engage in this discussion. We have a good group of attendees today. I have nearly 100 people on the call, which is great. So we will we'll get into the session. So first, I just want to introduce Maria. Maria, welcome. Maria's a chartered engineer with over 17 years experience in investment, planning, design and asset management for responsible infrastructure. She's a specialist in carbon management, particularly in the water utilities space, as well as regulatory environment. She has provided advisory services on operational practices, asset management, business case development, technical assessment and investment plans. Currently, Maria, the technical lead for the Net Zero Donald. I believe that's internationally.
Yeah.
She's based in London and is in lockdown right now. So
Yeah.
thank you, Maria, for joining us, and I'll hand over to you to take the floor.
Thank you very much. Cool. So yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Maria Mandaki. I'm from Greece, and I'm based in the UK. I'm in lockdown, like Toby said. I'm very excited actually to speak in this event. I was in New Zealand on some carbon discussions and projects actually last November, and it was very interesting to hear different views from the infrastructure clients and value chain, as well as the government on your ambition going forward, which is great actually. So today I'm going to give you only a 10-minute, if you like, brief overview, giving you some insights of what we see net zero meaning and what has been happening in the carbon space in general in the UK, but also this part of the world in Europe. And I would like to do that through three main propositions, basically. But to start with, if you could, next slide, please. I would like to just go to the basics of when we're talking about carbon emissions, which is essentially a shorthand for greenhouse gas emissions. We're talking about carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, etc. I would like to point out the fact that it's important when we look at infrastructure to look at those emissions in the context of control and influence. So infrastructure owners and the value chain in the UK for the last, I would say, over 8 years has been looking at carbon as capital carbon, so the carbon associated with the construction of assets, operational carbon, which is the carbon associated with operational of the assets, and user carbon, which is the carbon associated with the use of infrastructure. So in the little image on the right, the user carbon, basically, it's we as driving the car, if you were an asset owner, whereas the capital and operational carbon is the carbon for the road and the lamp, etc. This is quite important because people, and especially infrastructure asset owners can understand what emissions they have control on to directly reduce, and how can they engage with the users of infrastructure to influence their behaviors on the influence part. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of the UK context, and I think it's quite similar in New Zealand looking at the figures. So over 50% of the emissions in the UK, the total emissions, are associated in one way or another with infrastructure, with economic infrastructure. We're talking about energy, transport, water, waste, telecommunications. In New Zealand, this number, I think it's around 40%, 40+%, because you have a bit more emissions on the biogenic space with agriculture and land use. But what we're saying here is infrastructure definitely has a major role to play to reach us to net zero, yeah? And as you can see, the emissions that are under the control of infrastructure assets at the moment are over 15%, whereas for the influence, meaning the users' emissions, controlled emissions, are much higher, double those. So next slide, please. Okay, so the first proposition I would like to ask is quite important. This is to do with some practices of reducing carbon in the actual assets and the supply chains. Next slide, please. So in 2013, I was a co-author of this report. We did an analysis for the UK government, the Treasury, on, it was called an Infrastructure Carbon Review. And fundamentally, it was a sister document to the Infrastructure Cost Review, which was produced to see how we can reduce costs in delivering infrastructure. We're talking about strategic infrastructure here. And in the Infrastructure Carbon Review, we saw that leading organizations, when they're aligning their value chain and supply chain and trying to look at carbon as a proxy for resource efficiency, they managed to achieve over 40% reduction in capital carbon, which relate to about 20% reduction in costs for delivering new infrastructure, and a similar story to the operational carbon. We also had some significant economic benefits of this reduction in the assets that we're going to be delivering for the economy. Next slide, please. And when I mentioned the value chain, so this followed by PAS 2080, the first carbon management standard in infrastructure. I was a lead author for that, and we co-authored it, McDonald with Arab, for the British Standards Institution. And fundamentally, what that was is the first management standard that shows a practical way of how individual members of the supply chain, being an asset owner, a contractor, a consultant, a product material supplier, can work together, align their objectives, and set clear targets, baselines, quantifying carbon, monitoring progress, have the right leadership and governance to create some sort of a culture of challenge and innovation. And a lot of good things have come out in the last few years, in the UK at least, where we have seen the industry now looking at using zero carbon concrete, using digital technologies, off-site manufacturing for improving the efficiency and carbon in construction, as well as other new technologies and products. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next one, which for me it's the most complex and most interesting point around net zero and infrastructure is that, okay, so we've talked about how we reduce the carbon, capital and operational carbon when it comes to infrastructure assets, but this will not get us to net zero, especially when we know, at least in Europe, that about 70% of the infrastructure we'll be using in 2050 is already built or being built now. So next slide, please. So this is about understanding and looking at infrastructure as a, if you like, a highly interconnected system. And you see in that image on the right-hand side, this is from a very, very recent report that was published last week on a systems thinking. It's called Flourishing Systems. I would encourage you to look at that. So fundamentally, we're saying that infrastructure is part of a wider system. And we cannot look at individual assets in infrastructure in isolation. We have to look at them in the context of a wider system, how they interlap with each other in different sectors, with the users, as well as other enablers. So from a systems perspective, what has been happening in the UK since last year, we have also a committee of climate change here in the UK, like you have in New Zealand, and we have identified already a number of pathways to net zero for the country and for the different sectors of the economy, predominantly infrastructure, but also other like land use, etc. The main message is that there has to be a significant transition, if you like, to our infrastructure pipeline in order to meet that net zero target, especially in energy and transport. We're talking about, you know, decarbonizing, obviously, the electricity grid. You guys in New Zealand are in much better place because of the extent of renewables you have. We will have to consider hydrogen, emerging technologies. We'll have to look at transport infrastructure, not only from an electric vehicles point of view, but from future mobility and other electrification, obviously, of the rail stock. But also looking at carbon capture technologies, so the sequestration technologies, either CCS, engineered ones, or natural sequestration, which is the land use. Again, you guys in New Zealand have got a really good opportunity to use the amazing land bank you have, managed in a sustainable way, to be part of this equation. So the message here basically is that technologies, there have been many, many studies and work in the UK in the last few years around understanding what technologies and the role they will have to play to get the infrastructure to net zero. But more recently, it's all about the behaviors and user preferences. And we see the UK government as well, and a lot has been happening in Europe, to try and better understand what are the users' behaviors and preferences when it comes to net zero. Because remember, we said about over 50% of the emissions are about the user emissions. So it's about how do we make the users be part of that infrastructure system. And next slide, please. And the last point I would like to mention for a couple of minutes is the point on incentives around the net zero future. And this links, again, if you could go to the next slide, Carlos. This links again to the different players in the value chain, from governments to users, to regulators, to asset owners, designers, investors, etc. So what I have seen personally in the carbon management space is that the main blockers in making something happen when it comes to reducing carbon in infrastructure are to do with either lack of alignment or lack of incentives. So when we're talking about incentives for net zero, it's very, very important to understand that those incentives cannot just come from the government, meaning, okay, there are some successful stories, like, for example, the acceleration of offshore wind in the UK through contracts for difference, or the feed-in tariffs, you know, that have accelerated renewables in the last kind of decade or 20 years, or biomethane or other things, or heat. However, those incentives have to trickle down to the value chain. The regulators have to give the right kind of framework for asset owners to operate, and they in turn need to ask their designers, contractors, suppliers, and give them the right incentives to do these things. I mean, I was very glad to, when I was in New Zealand last November, working with my colleagues in Auckland and Watercare about the carbon basically project in their capital program. It's very good to see that they have started thinking about those incentives. And the last point here, before I wrap up, I would like to just say that in a net zero future, and we start seeing now in the UK and in Europe actually, that infrastructure has been starting being, as we said, as part of the system. So the value chain starts being less linear and more kind of, people playing different roles, new types of opportunities for
Yeah,
investors, for developers.
Gonna have
Yeah.
to jump in and cut you off. Sorry.
No, that's it. I finished. That's it. 10 minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. And yeah, I look forward to reflecting on that at the end. But next up we have Steve Killeen, who is the CEO of down in New Zealand. Over to you.
You may expect me to dive straight into construction, but I echo some of Maria's comments. I think if you construction techniques, but again, all it is improving is what we do project by project, which is as a unique opportunity to shape the future of New Zealand. And I think in doing that, we have to move away from certain artificial barriers that I see, such as the different Maria said, you need to move away from asset silos. And local to drive society's outcomes. So for example, if we take energy and transport working together, changing fuel sources, charging infrastructure could change our light vehicle fleet. Regenerative braking on our rail rolling stock could change the emissions on our rail networks. Hydrogen plants powered by our green power to create the electrolysis could lead to a fuel source for our heavy vehicle fleet. But you can also take that logic and apply it to changing travel patterns, changing where we live and work. So, for example, if you take energy and transport as a way of developing industry in provincial areas, you'll not only create a degree of social equity and social investment in the area, but you'll reduce the bottlenecks in our more congested spaces. So whether it's London or Auckland, they're terrible examples of how we've bottlenecked our infrastructure system, and as a result, decreased our quality of life. So I think it's all about that wider strategy and bringing our knowledge of infrastructure to bear in a positive way. I think in terms of what drives that, I mean, we have a great thing, Kayati Taki, in New Zealand. So we've got our guardianship, and I think if we start to collectively look at this as passing something positive to the next generation, that would be good. We need positive buying role models. CRL promoting ISCA was a very good thing for Downer on its learning journey, but also working with some local authorities on advancing new technology, advancing new materials in a holistic way has been positive. And I think we need to lead the debate in the middle ground. In my household, we use this Trump versus Greta as the extremes, which sometimes avoid the logical debate in the centre of how do we wish to progress as a society and move things forward in a way that is truly sustainable. So I think if we can put those things in place and really use the opportunity to have an overarching strategy, then net zero will be an outcome of a well-planned society, not something we strive for in isolation. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Very, very, very nicely put. It was, next up, we have Rosie Mercer, who is a GM of Sustainability at Auckland Ports. Rosie's been leading on the port's ambitious sustainability strategy. They're targeting a net zero target by 2040. And part of that is the port's hydrogen demonstration project, which all sounds very, very exciting. So over to you, Rosie.
Thank you, Toby. Tēnā koutou katoa. Yeah, I think there's a real air of excitement that's kind of intertwined with this. I kind of feel like it's like a blind fear about this sort of dichotomy between the opportunities and potential challenge. There's different trajectories that New Zealand could take coming out of COVID when you look at the infrastructure spend and how game-changing it could be, and how potentially, if we get it wrong, how utterly damaging. So working within a company like Ports of Auckland, you kind of get this really strong insight into how infrastructure impacts our ability to deliver on objectives in an operational sense. It kind of goes back to what both Maria and Steve were saying. And you know, we've got these objectives around, you know, an inclusive and regenerative future. And if you get the infrastructure wrong, you really hamstring yourself from being able to achieve some of those objectives. So, you know, I really believe in a systems approach here. And I think that, you know, both speakers so far have sort of touched on that. But there's no denying the impact that infrastructure has as both, you know, potentially the most significant challenge and roadblock to some of those futures that we envisage, but also presenting the pathways to the opportunities that we see. And take, for example, our zero carbon goals, and more recently, thanks to the leadership and influence of the Climate Leaders Coalition, our science-based targets that we've now committed to. So this target will require us to challenge the way we deliver our infrastructure projects, and it will also require us to influence the suppliers of our infrastructure projects, so the contractors and those who deliver them. The embodied emissions from one of our infrastructure projects, like for example a reinforced concrete wharf, is equivalent to our annual operating emissions for the entire port for a year. So it's not insignificant. And so we really do need to focus on how do we shift the dial in that space. And the flip side, of course, is the absolute reliance that we have on infrastructure for actually delivering these goals. And that's whether it's building our hydrogen demonstration plant or installing charging infrastructure for our new electric tug. You know, infrastructure really holds the key to, you know, New Zealand achieving this zero carbon future. Again, this systems approach it's just so important, but that's where it gets really challenging, because collaborating and partnering is hard, and finding those incentives that have a common goal, like where people have a common purpose, is actually, it's really challenging when you're talking about a systems approach at a national level. So one of the things that we've decided to do at Ports of Auckland is do our ops rating, our IS ops rating. And we think that this is going to be one of, you know, a really great opportunity for us to enable to bring our infrastructure team along and deliver the IS rating at an ops level, and try and drive, like lead from the front, but sort of encourage that pushing from behind for the infrastructure within the port. One of the other things I just want to mention is last year we built an app which is a supply chain carbon calculator. And what it does is it measures time, distance, and carbon emissions related to different freight options for moving freight through the country. And it's really interesting when you see how if you flip between different freight modes, the changes that has. But again, the infrastructure that inhibits the ability to, let's say, use more rail or use more coastal shipping to actually achieve some of that becomes quite challenging. And Ministry of Transport this week released their Green Freight working paper, which also acknowledges the interdependencies between the different systems and the infrastructure, but also on consumer choice. And when we're talking about incentives, it's not just about government incentives coming down financially, but actually as consumer choice starts to drive some of those market behaviours, what can we be doing to stay ahead of that and being able to deliver what consumers might want? So finding partnerships and collaboration opportunities, I think, is one of the most important things to do here. I think SBC does a fabulous job, and last year Kate Ferguson pulled together the working group for the low emission freight roadmap, and it allows you to bring together those partners and collaborators who are willing to start changing, and you can start leveraging off their strengths, and you can be more aware of their challenges and start to understand how the different parts of the system fit in together. And in this case, looking at the electrical grid, the electricity grid, restrictions and opportunities that might present itself for charging infrastructure, where hydrogen might be located throughout the country, how freight mode shifts will impact the businesses of different parties, and how we can get goods moving throughout the country more efficiently. So I think it's such a massive challenge. It's, you know, there's no denying that what we're trying to do here is phenomenally complex and challenging, but it's also super exciting to be part of it. And I do want to thank ISCA for bringing everyone together here, and for Maria for taking the time to share as well, because without that, we don't have that leadership sort of driving this change. So I think that it's really great that you've got so many participants here who are interested in wanting to be part of that.
Thank you, Rosie. That's fascinating. And next up, we have Mike Burrell, who's the Executive Director of the Sustainable Business Council of New Zealand. Mike's held various roles, including the High Commissioner for New Zealand in South Africa, the Director of Sustainable Economic Development for New Zealand's Foreign Affairs and Trade. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Toby, and thank you for the opportunity. It's always a bit daunting when you come in after 3 experts and leaders in infrastructure to talk as a generalist on this stuff, but I'll give it a go. I suppose I see this moment as a massive opportunity that we just have to grasp. And the opportunity has presented itself as a crisis. Opportunities often do. But these were things that we knew we needed to do, and now we just need to do them at pace and at scale. And if I look at what I've heard over the last 3 or 4 weeks from leaders like those who are assembled in front of me and those who are listening, it's really incredible to see the shift in the way that people are talking about what needs to happen. If you look at what we've had to do with COVID-19, we've had to completely turn around and action things that we didn't even know we had to do in the past. And we've done it at scale and rapidly, and we've done it. We've just got on with it and we've done it. If you think about that as being, an acute crisis, as a colleague said to me yesterday, that's an acute crisis. With climate, of course, you're talking about something that is much longer term. So I see this as an opportunity, and I see it in 3 ways. The first is exactly as Rosie's just been talking about. It's about collaboration. We're not going to achieve the significant shifts that we need over the next 30 years to deliver on net zero operating in isolation. And for me, that means that we need some common objectives, and the strategy that Steve talked about, I think, is critical. It's notable that we have a lot of sector strategies, but what we're lacking is a net zero strategy. We've got a policy, we've got a piece of legislation. Now we actually need the specific work that needs to happen to tick off what needs to happen in the next 5 years, the next 10 years. And that's where the Climate Leaders Coalition and organisations like SBC, I think, have a role. Steve and Rosie are both members of that, and I think we can really leverage the knowledge within that network. The second thing that we can do is we can take the opportunity that's been presented to us right now to have a say into how the next phase of spending is spent in New Zealand, that so-called Wave 3. I know Wave 2 was something of an anticlimax. Essentially, it was just pulling open our bottom drawers, looking at what was in there and spending on that. I get it though. We needed to pump prime the economy. Unemployment is obviously a real big concern. But the next piece now is, I think, on us to go to government to say, right, here's the things that you need to spend on now that maybe we would have spent on in 5 years' time. But look, you're going to spend billions anyway. Let's spend it sensibly. And to me, that's about utilising SBC, the Climate Leaders Coalition, and organisations like ISCA and others to bring that together in a coherent way that's sensible. Now, fortunately, a lot of that work has already been done at a relatively high level. Now it's about picking out those things that we know would be implementable over the next 5 to 10 years. So to me, that's another practical thing that we can do. And then the third thing that I think we can do is that we can reach across to government to say, actually, we need a partnership here. There's a lot that industry, that the private sector can bring in terms of ideas, in terms of the practicalities of how these things work, in terms of investment. A lot of this investment is going to be private investment. So that engagement with government, I think, is really critical. And it's there is some of that going on, but I think it could happen at a higher level. And I think it could be, frankly, we could take a bit of a leaf out of the book in Australia, where actually that's plugging straight into the senior leadership in New Zealand. I think your approach there is fantastic. So those are 3 ideas for some actions that we could take. For me, what we're doing now is we're tweaking our strategy for the SBC so that the climate transition is at the heart of everything that we do, because it's the single most important thing that's going to happen in my lifetime and probably everyone else here. So we're making that our main priority, and everything else comes in around that. And that transition, of course, is both the physical transition, the environmental transition, but there's a social and economic transition as well. And Rosie was talking about that earlier. There are going to be winners and losers with this transition, and we have to make sure that there are as many winners as possible. So that's going to be, I think, a challenge with investment and skills and training and these sorts of things. I'll just leave you with one last thought, which is that New Zealand historically hasn't been afraid of being a bit ahead of the curve. And I feel that in the last couple of decades, we got a bit timid. We lost our leadership chops. And I think it's actually time that we step back into it. I've just had 8 years in the Foreign Service. And what I can tell you is that at the moment, a lot of people are looking to small countries like New Zealand for being that beacon on the hill. To say, for goodness sake, if a country of 5 million at the bottom of the South Pacific can't do this, nobody can. So in fact, there's a leadership element to this that I think is really important. Those people who say that New Zealand's not important because, just tell me I'm going over my 5 minutes, those people who say that New Zealand's insignificant in terms of its carbon emissions are right, but it's not insignificant in terms of the demonstration, in terms of the credibility that brings us to show that we can actually shift and then share that experience with others. And there are other countries like Denmark and others who are doing the same. So joining that fast-moving club, I think, is very important.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. All right, Mike. I should have mentioned earlier that we have a Q&A function in this webinar. So if you go to the bottom of the screen, you'll see there is a Q&A button. If you type your questions in there, they appear to all the panelists. So please, attendees, put your questions in there, and we'll endeavour to get them answered. We have a couple already that we'll put to the panelists. I think I'll start with the bottom one here. The question is, what are your favourite real-world examples of truly systemic thinking on infrastructure? I'll give each of the panelists a minute to answer that one, because I think it's been a common theme across a lot of all the presentations. So great question. I'll start with Rosie, I guess. You're gonna launch into that one.
Thanks, Toby. It's a great question, and you know, in to be honest, at a global level and within New Zealand, I don't think, you know, I think part of the problem is that no one does this particularly well, and you have challenges like, you know, a very capitalist-based financial system which requires infrastructure to deliver financial rewards rather than, you know, a triple bottom line approach. But outside of my Ports of Auckland work, I've been really fortunate to be part of the Provincial Growth Fund, and one of the most exciting projects that I watched sort of come to fruition is the Opotiki Harbour development. And you can look it up, and it's just this truly remarkable evolution of the community, iwi, business, all coming together and striving for a common goal based on a vision that they have for lifting their community out of the severe social deprivation that they currently sit within. And it's taken them, you know, a good 15 years of this project developing. And finally, at the start of this year, it was announced that the government would be funding this harbour development, which would unlock these economic opportunities. And it really was, and it still stands for me as one of the most remarkable examples of, you know, the coming together of local government, central government, the iwi, business community, and the whole community there driving for this project to happen there for them. You can look that project up, and it is it really was truly remarkable.
Great, thank you, Rosie. Maria, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so great, great answer, Rosie. I mean, I totally agree with Rosie that unfortunately the way we're set up in most economies, it's very difficult to find one place that the system is perfect. So I have seen most in either small developments that are a little bit more like but it's not a community really, just a development with buildings and some infrastructure, some, for example, use of biogas and exporting renewables and that sort of thing. Or on the other hand, you see some of the rural communities having more of the natural capital, if you like, integrated, but I haven't seen yet. I've seen a lot of aspirations, a lot of great things that are happening with synergies between energy, transport, other sectors, but not the whole system that I can tell you, you know. In the UK, I would say Bristol could be one of the most, if you like, advanced cities in having those things out there. But yeah, if you ask me about the rest, I wouldn't say. Yeah, I haven't seen anything perfect. That's why it's an opportunity to create New Zealand, the first perfect example, you know.
The first perfect system. Well,
Absolutely.
there's a challenge thrown out there. Steve, do you want to jump in on that one and see if you can guide us towards this perfect system?
Yeah, I don't think I've found the perfect system. Probably the one I've seen more firsthand is France. I think they've actually done some excellent work in transport and power distribution that's cut across regional boundaries, and to a certain degree has factored in the economic argument, but has also factored in the social equity. So extending, for example, their high-speed rail in a way that's not necessarily economic on the rail case, but does add some stimulus to the local or provincial environments. So I think that's a very positive trend. I hear this from my Scottish friends. I hear there's some great things done in the Scottish Islands, where they really have turned on a dime and been quite ambitious in how they power their fleet of ships using hydrogen and the like. So, and Scotland again has used green energy particularly well and was an early adopter of wind farms for some obvious reasons. But I think they've done very well for the nature of their environment. And I hear Shanghai, and I've not seen this firsthand, I'm keen to, but I'm told there's a building that houses the city plan that goes for the next 100 years. And as a resident, you can go in and you can see what the plan is and why the plan is, which I think that degree of effectively commitment to the long term is very positive for people to get on board and understand. So in many ways, that would be my aspiration for New Zealand. I think we're very good at innovating and have a willingness to adapt new technology. I think what would be nice is to see a national plan that knits the needs of our urban and our rural communities together, because they don't work in isolation economically, and they shouldn't physically.
Fascinating. Okay, Mike, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I suppose the Christchurch rebuild was the first attempt we'd had in modern times to take a sort of systems approach to something like that. There's no doubt that the early sort of idealistic phase gave way to pragmatism reasonably quickly. And I think that says probably something about where we've come from. You know, and New Zealand has always both been a leader, but also, you know, we do tend to tilt to the extremes. You know, when everyone else was left, we were very left. When everyone else was liberal, we were very liberal. This kind of, you know, middle ground place is not something that we happily inhabit. But actually, I think we need it. At the moment, I'd agree with what Steve says. You know, actually, we do need some plans here, and that's not about picking winners or some sort of Stalinist plot. It's really just pragmatism. It's about saying, in a small country like New Zealand, which is basically the size of a city, a small city, you know, we actually should be able to make some plans for ourselves and put in place the infrastructure, which is going to hit that triple bottom line that Rosie was talking about. So I think that's one. I'm fascinated by what the Netherlands is currently doing with their sort of donut economy approach to their response. How that comes out, I'm not sure, but it's quite interesting. It's certainly taking into account social and environmental aspects as well as economic, and they are consciously trying to build that into their rebuild, which I think is laudable. Again, how that will work in practice, I don't know. I was in London in the mid '90s, and all the regenerative work that was done there had very high ideals. Sometimes that wasn't delivered on when it came to the practicalities of what was actually delivered. And then, of course, Denmark has for a long time taken, I think, a relatively holistic approach to a lot of its development. So those would be some examples that I can think of.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Fascinating answers. And we have some really good questions now streaming in. So we might change tack slightly off the systems discussion, which is truly fascinating. I think we could go on for hours about. But there's a question here around the COVID response, because I think it's pertinent and we do need to give it airtime. So the question is, COVID provides a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do things differently. Are there any lessons we can apply from COVID to the net zero trajectory pathway? May as well, Mike, do you want to keep going, seeing as you're warmed up, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks for that. The short answer is yes, there's many lessons. I suppose the first lesson is all of the BS that we've heard over the last 20 years, that this is all too hard, is just that, it's BS. You know, if we think that you know, changing to net zero is going to negatively affect the economy to the extent that COVID has, then we're kidding ourselves. It's a reminder that you know, that these kind of massive shocks happen. They're real things, and unfortunately, we belong to a generation where we haven't really seen real shocks. Our grandparents did. You know, they saw a couple of world wars and a depression. We hadn't, and now we have. And I think so. The first thing is to remind ourselves what a global shock truly looks like, and to remember that this is a walk in the park compared to what climate change would look like. So that's the first thing. I think, you know, it is a reminder. The second thing is it says you can do stuff at pace and at scale internationally to respond to these crises. One of the things I thought was quite interesting is my wife is still working for the Foreign Ministry, and I would hear these phone calls where they would be basically making policy decisions in an hour or 3 hours that normally would have taken 2 or 3 years to get to, because they had to. They had no choice. What it shows is a lot of our policy processes are far too slow. They're not definitive enough. And they're certainly not bold enough. And that also goes for our investment decisions. Most of our investment decisions are quite timid. So this shows to me that we can do it. When push comes to shove, we can do it. The critical thing is, can we do it ahead of time? Because humans are very bad at doing these things ahead of time. We like doing them at the last minute. So the final thing for me around this, I suppose, in relation to New Zealand, is that what we weren't ready for was an opportunity like this to say, well, occasionally government will have to spend a lot of money. Do we have a bottom drawer with a whole lot of good ideas for things that need to happen that we can pull out and say, here's one we prepared earlier? It turned out we didn't. We didn't. And I think that's what we need to have. We need it now, but we're going to need it in the future. So that when these opportunities drop, we can say, actually, boy, we've got a fantastic idea for you. It's all worked up. We've done the economics on it. Here it is, ready to go. Bang. And what that showed to me, I suppose, is that we haven't really got down to the nitty-gritty of the net zero transition. We're still talking at a relatively high level. We now need to get down to the nitty-gritty to say, what does the next 2 years look like? What does the next 5 years look like? You know, we've got to halve our emissions by 2030. 10 years we've got to halve them. That's going to be massive. What does that look like specifically, sector by sector, and to Steve's point, across sectors? Because we can't have these things sitting in silos. So there's a lot to learn from COVID. I hope we don't forget it. I hope we internalize it now. That's why I think we need to really take advantage of this crisis, you know, push ahead now, because we may not get this opportunity for another 5, 10 years, and then it will be an even bigger crisis.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Maria, do you want to jump in there also?
Yeah, so I echo Mike's comment. I agree totally that this is the opportunity now that we have the momentum of making decisions fast, because also from what I've seen, there has been a lot of talk in Europe about plans, net zero pathways, etc. But when it comes to concrete plans, it has only been done something in the last year or so, rather than all these years that has been talk. We know that all countries in the world, at least the major economies, will have to invest in something like infrastructure to get out of the crisis anyway. So for me, it's a no-brainer to just start purposing this infrastructure to the net zero target. For me, it's a no-brainer. I don't have anything else to say, but yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen in the UK, we just have had the Green Recovery Plan as well published. So yeah, it's along those lines, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Steve, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't want to lose the learnings from our COVID-19 reflection. For us, we created a fully flexible workforce working in an entirely different way. I think certainly for our non-site-based roles, we were very productive, and we created more balance in our lives, and we took cars off the road. So there was a real positive in that. From an entrepreneurial point of view, we had people at home printing on their 3D printers, masks for doctors, which fascinated me. I didn't know the talent that lay within the business and the hobbies that can be brought to bear to solve problems. Our materials laboratories converted their skill sets to make hand sanitizer. So 1 minute they're playing with bitumen, the next minute they've adapted their skill sets and they're helping to solve a problem almost unprompted. And I think perhaps the other thing is we work together as teams with skill sets across the board. So it goes to, we break the silos behind organizations, but we also break the silos between disciplines. And it's one challenge engineers face is how do they articulate the message, taking into account the economics, the technology, the social factors. But if you've got a team that's holistic, you can do that. And when I saw our comms team, IT team, accountants, zero harm, HR working together to solve a problem rather than working in their specific discipline, it told me that there's something in that we mustn't lose, and it can be adapted to any problem, including net zero.
Yeah, fascinating. Rosie, you want to jump in there too?
I think it's probably everyone said all the right things there about the COVID. I was wondering if I could answer a couple of the questions around consumer choices, because it's quite relevant to some of the direction that we have taken at the port. So there's a question there about how do we influence the behaviour of them, and what role do the consumers play? And it's been really interesting in our journey at the port so far, when we have looked at what is important to our community and our stakeholders, and having a zero emission port in the CBD, that's our vision, is that that's going to be something that will be valued by the city. But in order to achieve something like that and sort of realise that vision, we need to be able to make an economic case for delivering on something like this. And you don't get an economic case simply on the basis of your community will like it, and you have to be able to provide the end user with a product that they will value. And there's no denying that what we are trying to do at the moment costs a phenomenal amount of money in terms of reducing operational emissions. So and what I mentioned earlier about the role that infrastructure plays is that can really help to reduce the annual costs that we have for our emission reductions. But if you try to tackle it without infrastructure and you're just trying to reduce your operational emissions, it's phenomenally expensive. And so you have to be able to demonstrate that you can recover that value in some shape or form. And we've always been quite confident that consumers are starting to want this kind of product. So a low carbon freight option for their product when it gets to the shop where they purchase it. And we know that there's this groundswell of interest in having a low carbon future, but actually the reality is that when consumers make a decision, the majority of the time at the moment, they are still making it based on price. And there is still a shift to go before we actually get consumers really starting to drive that change. And you have certain, there's some big cargo movers in the country who are really starting to drive this, and they're making it more visible. So the more we get the visibility of those carbon differentials out there, the more people will start to understand that there is a choice to make. But I think that part of not knowing, part of the reason that we're not seeing such a strong push in that direction from the consumers is because of the lack of visibility of it. So in terms of what can we be doing, what can designers, engineers be doing in terms of going through those design phases to influence this, I think the stakeholder-led design philosophy of the IS ratings is super important here, because you really, when you're designing something, you have to understand the value that infrastructure owner is trying to get and what they're trying to achieve longer term. Not just, hey, deliver us a project, but actually the operation of that asset goes for far longer than the build phase. And that's the part that infrastructure owner has to live with for all of those years. So understanding what they're trying to achieve, understanding whatever behavioural changes they're trying to make. So if we're wanting to create a freight task shift from, mode shift from, say, road to rail, what is it that we need inside the infrastructure to encourage the user to actually make that shift? So there's certainly not a quick fix for this, but you definitely have to understand what the infrastructure owner is trying to achieve in the longer term.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Rosie. I would love to throw this question over to the other panelists, but we're running out of time. Unless there's a burning, very quick response from either of you. Otherwise, I'll just start wrapping up. Unfortunately, the nature of the format means we can't run over. it was today's session was too short, frankly. There's so many juicy topics that we could have delved into, but I think what was fascinating, or what came through loud and clear, was the need for better systems thinking and the understanding of the interconnections and the influence different pieces of infrastructure and parts of the community are going to have on this. I think I particularly like there was some discussion around, breaking down this distinction between social infrastructure and economic infrastructure. I think it's a really great point. I think that what we're trying to deliver is infrastructure that returns positive value to society, whether it's called economic or social. Likewise, there were some great discussions around silos and the challenges that they create, and we've all seen that. I think that it went on and on. I think it's a particular pet favorite of mine. This interdependence, and I think we could go into for hours about it. But then there was some further discussion around the importance of partnership, science-based targets, setting clear targets came through loud and clear as a key way of driving outcomes longer term. And also the need for a clear net zero strategy, which I think with some more detail around it and collaboration around that, both within industry, government, and between different agencies. I think is what was hinted at, and that an opportunity there for you guys in New Zealand to take a real leadership role in that, which is, I think, really, really interesting. The general consensus around COVID is, we should be able to respond, I think, at pace. What I guess it's articulated that we could be better prepared and we could have respond faster. But really, what it's shown is that people are very adaptable, and there's some positives coming out of this, some productivity gains even. And then we touched briefly on consumers and their role in this. And again, this is a whole topic that we could spend hours talking about, and it's in its own regard. And I feel like we haven't given it enough time. But I think that it was loud and clear that we need a consumer signal to help drive this. Is one of the drivers, not the only one, obviously, but it's an important one. And that there's a need to communicate better with consumers potentially, and the IS process can help articulate those long-term journeys. So little plug for us there in the end, which is nice to hear. I want to just thank everyone for coming along. We're at the end now. So Rosie, Maria, Steve, Mike, thank you very much for attending and contributing. It was really, really fascinating. It's bringing different perspectives to this discussion. There's a whole bunch of questions we haven't answered. We will try to answer those offline and get back to the people who asked those questions. There's some really good ones in the mix. We just ran out of time. And I also would like to ask you all to come to our next session, next NZ Connect session, which is on the 10th of June, which is our ISCA Verify panel. So lessons learned and experiences from the perspective of our very experienced verifiers. So we've come to an end, and again, thank you all. Thank you to the attendees who've dropped in and asked the questions, and I hope it was useful for everyone. Certainly, I found it interesting, and till next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, guys.
Very enjoyable. Thank you.